Hi, this is Madison from the Davis Food Co-op, and today we're going to be making kombucha. So I'm making a batch of tea that I'm going to be using for my next batch of kombucha. It is about 2.5 liters of water and organic green tea from the Davis Food Co-op bulk department, and I used a 1/4 cup of sugar per 1 cup of water. I'm heating it up to about 130 degrees because that's what green tea wants. Once it reaches that, I'll leave it for about 3 minutes and then strain it. So this kombucha that I have here has just finished its first round of fermentation. The SCOBY has been sitting inside of this tea for 7 days. If this is your first time making kombucha and this is your first SCOBY that's just been finished, the water that is in here is going to be way too vinegary. To make a SCOBY, it sits in the water for 4 weeks. So this kombucha is not going to taste good. You're going to want to dump it out, hold on to your SCOBY and a little bit of the liquid, and we'll show you how to start a new batch in a minute. Something that you can do is when you think it's finished its first round of fermentation is you can taste it to see if you've added enough sugar, to see if the SCOBY has been sitting in there for long enough, and to make sure that it's not too vinegary. So you don't have to worry about being too careful with your SCOBY when you're just using a spoon. You can push down the SCOBY a little bit, it won't hurt it. You can also grab some of the brown colored yeast that's floating around in there. I'm not a big fan of grabbing that, but if you're up for it, you can go ahead and try it. It's a really great probiotic. So the first step of starting your second round of fermentation is going to be to remove the SCOBY. You want to make sure that your hands are really, really clean when you're doing this. Your SCOBY is a living being. You want to make sure that you don't have any germs on your hand that you could get into the kombucha. And I've been using this same SCOBY for a couple months now, so it has gotten really thick. It is actually just about ready to split into 2 different SCOBYs. Then I'll have this mother SCOBY on top, and this one, the baby, the new one, you can give away to somebody. There's even ways where you can dry it out and turn it into probiotic gummies, or they make really, really great fertilizers you can put in your garden. So I'm gonna set this aside so that way I can strain this kombucha. So you want to strain it because there are those brown things that are floating around on the inside. It's extra yeast. So I strain it so that way you don't get any of that extra yeast into your bottle during the second round of fermentation. So I'm going to fill these up, and I want to make sure I have a couple inches of room at the top. One, so that way I'll have room to fit some of my flavors, and you want to leave room at the top so that way when CO2 builds up in here from the fermentation process, it has space to expand. It has space to build up some pressure. So once you've finished pouring your strained or filtered kombucha into the bottles, you want to be sure to put your SCOBY back right away. You don't want to leave your SCOBY out where it has access to a lot of light or could dry out. So we want to put this back in here, and then we can set this aside while we fill these with our different flavors. Take this plate away. I'll come back. So now we're going to fill these bottles with the different flavors, with the different fruit that we already prepped. Okay, so before we start bottling up our kombucha, and I'll talk about that process in a minute, let's talk about what ingredients I've already prepped. So I have peaches here. I've taken the peels off of the peaches because the peaches have a lot of tannins. So I remove the peels so that way I don't get that grainy, kind of fuzzy and bitter texture or flavor in my kombucha. I have apricots, and I've left the skin on there. They have kind of a tangy, tiny bit bitter skin, and I actually really, really like it, so I'm gonna leave those on. I have coarsely chopped rosemary, coarsely chopped sage, and lavender. The rosemary and the sage both have a subtler flavor, so I chop them up so that way there's like more of a surface area. You have access to more of the oils on the inside of the herb. The lavender, however, is really strong, so I just leave those whole. And you really need only 1 piece of lavender per bottle. If you add more, you'll get a little bit of an essential oil flavor to your kombucha. I also have pitted dates. Pitted dates are a great way to add some natural sugars to it to sweeten it up a little bit. These ones I've actually let sit for a little bit longer, so they started to form some sugar crystals on the outside. And then last but not least, I have some grated ginger. I've used just coarsely chopped or big chunks of ginger in the past in my kombucha, but I found that it wasn't strong enough. So I use grated ginger so that way I can get that really, really nice sharp ginger flavor to it. So with this one, I'll just start with apricot. Okay, so we finished bottling up these kombuchas. We want to put these in a cool, dark place for somewhere between 3 to 10 days. They are starting their second round of fermentation. This process helps absorb some of the flavors that we added to it. You want to put them in a cool, dark place, and then in a couple days you'll be able to drink them. The night before you open them, you do want to put them in the fridge beforehand. CO2 starts to build up, so you want to cool down the temperature so that way the pressure decreases a little bit before you open them up. So that way you don't experience what we experienced in the beginning of this video. If you are making kombucha on a budget, you can also use the glass containers that you get store-bought kombucha in. Just sanitize those, clean them out, and then you can start your second round of fermentation in those bottles. You just want to be sure to burp them regularly, if not daily. Burping them means that you open up the cap to release the CO2 that's building up on the inside. These are pretty high quality brewing bottles, so there's a very low chance of them breaking, but the store-bought glass bottles, the CO2 could build up too much and they could shatter, so you want to be sure to burp them. So now that these are done, we can set them aside. Now we want to start our next batch of kombucha. So if this is the first time you're making kombucha and your SCOBY has just finished, you would start this same process. So first we're going to remove our SCOBY again. You want to make sure that your hands are nice and clean. And I'm just going to set it on a clean plate. And then I can add the tea that I made earlier. You want to make sure that your tea has cooled down to at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to use an electric thermometer that I have and just check the temperature. And it's cooled down to 79 degrees Fahrenheit. And now I can add it in with about 10 to 12 ounces of my original kombucha. Depending on how much kombucha you are making, you'll want to keep some of the original first batch fermentation kombucha. So this is a 3 liter container. So I'm keeping about 10 to 12 ounces of my original kombucha. If you're using a gallon container to brew your first round fermentation kombucha in, you want to use a little bit more, maybe 12 to 16 ounces of your original kombucha. Now that I've put that tea in, I'm gonna put my SCOBY back in. I'm gonna put a cloth on the very top of it, and I'm gonna close the lid. You don't wanna clamp down the lid all the way because your SCOBY interacts with the liquid and the oxygen, the air that it comes in contact with. So you wanna be sure that air is still able to get onto the inside without letting bugs or germs get into the inside. That's why we use a cloth. And now I will set this in a cool, dark place for 5 to 7 days. I repeat this every 7 days, but you can play around with how many days it takes and figure out which one makes the best kombucha that you like. I think it's really helpful to keep a kombucha journal so you can keep track of how much sugar you use, how long you let it sit, what the weather was like if it was 100 degrees in your apartment that week. So that way you know all of the contributing factors to making the kombucha that you really like that week. Okay, go. So within the next 3 to 10 days, you will have your first batch of kombucha ready to drink. You can comment or subscribe below, and we'll see you again soon.